Rydell from Kaposia, who I will introduce now. Thanks, Kathy, you made my day. Can everybody hear me without the microphone? My voice projecting enough? Okay. I also want to welcome you and thank you for coming today. I just want to remind people, if you have a cell phone and you haven't turned it off, please do so now. Just check that. I also want to thank Highway Federal Credit Union because this is a wonderful space. When we started planning this, we were talking about rec centers and this and that, and then Gary, who is our development director at Kaposia, said, "Oh, I bet Highway Federal Credit Union will let you use their space because they're very, very open to the disability community and make this space available on a regular basis." So I want to thank them. As Kathy mentioned, we've been at this for a while. Starting in 2003, Kaposia became a community partner with the City of St. Paul in their Minority Business Development and Retention Initiative. And the purpose of that initiative was to really leverage affirmative action laws to get better outcomes in employment and economic opportunities for women, minorities, and people with disabilities. We were the only community partner that represented people with disabilities at that time. All of the other groups represented women and minorities. And to be perfectly honest, we had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. We thought there were all of these employers out there who needed to hire people with disabilities or wanted to hire people with disabilities, and our job was going to be to connect them with qualified candidates for jobs. What we quickly learned was that at that time, when people talked about diversity and inclusion, they were not thinking about people with disabilities. They were thinking about women and minorities. The other thing that we learned was that we had agreed to do what these other organizations representing women and minorities were supposed to do, but there were no goals for people with disabilities to facilitate employment opportunities. So it reminded me a little bit of, if you remember, Texas Governor Ann Richards, who talked about when women had to sort of take their place, and she pointed to, as a metaphor, to the dance team of Fred Astaire and Ginger Roberts, and pointed out that Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did, only moving backwards in high heels. And that kind of felt like what we were being asked to do, perhaps with the addition of doing it all on a slope. So we quickly learned that we really needed to start at the beginning and advocate for the same kinds of goals for people with disabilities as already existed for women and minorities. So the kinds of goals that we were talking about that are out there for women and minorities, and we support that, there's a need for that, were goals on affirmative action plans, so that contractors and subcontractors doing business with the City of St. Paul would have to report on the composition of their workforce and how many women and minorities were there. There are also goals for disadvantaged business enterprises. And the categories were for women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, and small businesses. There was no category for business owners with disabilities. And then the third goal area was goals actually on the workforce on construction projects. And again, the reporting was around women and minorities. Now, I don't want to single out the City of St. Paul for not having these goals because they're not alone. As a lot of you sitting in this room who are part of government, different parts of governments, you know that they don't necessarily exist in your system either. To the city's credit, they do now have a goal for affirmative action plans and report on the composition of their workforce and how many people with disabilities are part of that. And I know that many of you in the audience have similar kinds of goals, and those are really important. What still doesn't exist very much are goals related to business owners with disabilities or goals for the workforce. And the reason that we keep advocating year after year are some of these statistics. 21% is the employment rate right now for people with disabilities in the United States. The employment rate for people without disabilities is 69%. So that means that the rate of employment for people with disabilities is less than a third that of the general population. And that employment rate is not that low because people don't want to work. It's not because people can't work. It's for a variety of factors, but one of the important factors is how we think about disability. And unfortunately, in the general public, disability is almost synonymous with people who don't work. Another statistic that is truly startling has recently been identified by researchers who are starting to do research on poverty and disability. And what they found is that 65%, almost two-thirds of the individuals who experience poverty long-term, so people who do not move out of poverty, are people with disabilities. So people with disabilities are vastly underrepresented in terms of employment and greatly overrepresented in terms of poverty. And that's not surprising because obviously the best road out of poverty is working, unless you can win the lottery, and not everybody can do that. When we started this, we felt like we were sort of this lone voice in the forest. And people would kind of look at us and say, people with disabilities working in construction or having businesses, what planet did you come from? And although it's been a while, we do see some progress. As Kathy mentioned, people are starting to talk about women, minorities, and people with disabilities. The state of Minnesota recently raised the workforce participation rate for minorities. And in the communication that they sent out, they actually mentioned that they don't have a goal for people with disabilities. Now, at one time, that wouldn't have been mentioned. So I think it's actually a positive sign that they're embarrassed enough that they would say, we know we don't have a goal, we're working on it, there are some things we have to do. So, you know, it's an odd kind of progress, but it is progress. Also, at the end of 2011, the Obama administration proposed regulations affecting affirmative action plans and setting a 7% workforce participation rate for people with disabilities, which would mean that contractors and subcontractors wanting to access federal dollars would need to start reporting on their workforce inclusion of people with disabilities and move toward a target of 7%. And they're not out there yet, but I think all of these things are signs that all of this is coming. So we see some progress. We still have a long way to go. This is Alfred. And Alfred's a person with a disability. And if you look at Alfred through the lens of an IQ test or a standardized assessment, you're going to come to the conclusion that there's an awful lot of things that Alfred can't do. And one of those conclusions would probably be that Alfred can't work. What those measures miss is that Alfred really wants to work, and he has some really good skills. He has worked for over 10 years cleaning hotels, hotel rooms, and you would want to stay in one of the rooms that he had cleaned because Alfred's work is meticulous. He pays great attention to detail. He doesn't cut corners, and he takes great pride in his work. Now, this is not a picture of Alfred cleaning a hotel room. This is a picture of Alfred when Alfred is making over $30 an hour. And Alfred is making over $30 an hour because he's working on a construction site. And what he's doing is some of the final cleanup in one of the condos that was part of the Rondo Library project. And he did a fabulous job, and he had the opportunity to make that kind of money because he was provided an opportunity. The city of St. Paul, the unions, Krauss Anderson, that was the prime contractor, worked with Kaposia to make this happen. The purpose being to demonstrate what people can do. I'm hoping that you felt a little bit of a shift in your impression about Alfred as I talked about him in the story. Because that's the kind of shift that really needs to occur to really impact that employment rate. People with disabilities have lots of skills, and what they need are opportunities like the one that Alfred had to demonstrate those skills. Some of you in the audience are policymakers. Some of you are advocates. We really need for you to keep working on pushing for these kinds of goals for people with disabilities. And others of you are from different government agencies, and I know that you're at different levels in terms of the types of goals that you work with right now for people with disabilities. And what we want you to hear loud and clear is that you can always do something wherever you are. You can always leverage what you have and proactively try to move things a little farther along. And I think that this morning you're going to get some really good information that will be helpful in terms of doing that. Some of the barriers that we hear about setting some of these goals are going to be addressed today. One of those is what we hear is we can't set goals for people with disabilities because people with disabilities don't have to disclose that they have a disability. So how can you make an employer try to reach a goal where they can't even ask people if they have a disability? And there's some truth to that, but it's not quite as hard and fast as people seem to think, and we're going to focus on that and the relationship between self-disclosure and the Americans with Disabilities Act and affirmative action. The other thing that we hear a lot is businesses can't find qualified candidates for the job openings that they have. And you're also going to hear about vocational rehabilitation services, which is a wonderful resource for businesses and can connect them with a pool of qualified candidates. So our agenda this morning is we have a wonderful panel of presenters, and I'm really interested to hear what John Choi has to say, because it sounds like he's discovered some things that I don't know about yet, which I hope so. I'm going to be listening carefully. And what we'll do is each of the panelists here is going to make a short presentation. I'd like you to hold your questions until they've all finished. So if a question comes to you, jot it down, and we will have a question and answer session after they're all done. And after your questions get answered, we'll take a little bit of time to talk about next steps. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panel. We're going to start off with John Choi. And John is the Ramsey County Attorney. And John recently received an Excellence in Diversity Award from the Ramsey County Bar Association, and John is truly, truly deserving of that award. When I first met John, he was the St. Paul City Attorney, and he was wonderful to work with and did a lot of work in terms of affirmative action. Cindy Tarshish is next to John, and Cindy is with ADA Minnesota, so she's going to talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act and that whole issue of disclosure and affirmative action plans. Steve Kuntz will be next. Steve is with Vocational Rehabilitation Services, and he'll talk about what a wonderful resource their organization can be to businesses who want to hire people with disabilities. And our last person is Clifton Boyd. Clifton is the owner of B&L Supply, which is a business providing electrical and cleaning supplies in St. Paul. Clift is also the past president of the National Association of Minority Contractors in the Upper Midwest. And Clift is a business owner who actually has used vocational rehabilitation services and can tell you about how that's really impacted his small business. So we're going to start with John Choi.